Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Tracking Progress in Oil and Gas. The webinar is organised by the Transition Pathway Initiative, TPI Centre, part of the Grantham Institute Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment, which itself is part of the London School of Economics and Political Science. My name is David Russell, and I'm chair of the board of the TPI, the investor initiative, of which the TPI Centre is the academic research partner. The TPI is a global asset owner-led initiative supported by asset managers and service providers. It was launched in 2017 to provide asset owners and asset managers with the information they needed to understand how companies and now countries are transitioning towards the requirements of the Paris Agreement or net zero. From those early days, the TPI has expanded significantly and currently counts over 150 supporters globally, which collectively have around $60 trillion in assets under management and advisement. This is the sixth of a regular series of webinars that TPI started in autumn 2023, and we focus on the oil and gas sector as one of the 11 high-emitting sectors covered by the TPI Centre. There's strong interest in the oil and gas sector from investors. Oil and gas plays a pivotal role in global energy supply and has itself a significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. How companies in the sector are or are not planning to transition, and how they are investing for the future and in what will be critical in achieving alignment with the Paris Agreement or net zero by 2050. This webinar will provide an overview of the TPI's oil and gas carbon performance methodology and the results of the latest carbon performance assessment in 51 companies. It will also present the findings of the first iteration of the net zero standard for oil and gas co-developed with the IIGCC and a pilot of 10 company assessments and their underlying transition plans. Just to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the TPI's website, transitionpathwayinitiative.org, along with all the other TPI related data and information. I will now hand you over to Valentine Yan, Principal Research Project Manager at TPI Centre and Chair for this webinar. And he will introduce the agenda and the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So first of all, welcome to this webinar. I will first present the TPI Centre and provide a little bit of context on the research centre itself. This will be followed by my colleague Ali Amin, who's going to talk about the carbon performance of oil and gas companies, delving into the question of the alignment of oil and gas companies' climate targets, which will be followed by my colleague Jared Sharp, who's going to dive into the question of how are these targets supported by specific transition plans. We'll then hear from two users of TPI data, Dan Gardner from the IIGCC and Bruce Duguid from EOS at Federated Hermes. By the end, we'll have a Q&A session, so please keep the questions coming throughout the webinar. Use the box at the bottom. Unfortunately, there's a box for chats that is not going to work. So please use the Q&A section and keep upvoting questions that you like. If we move on to the next slide. As David mentioned, the TPI Centre is a research centre that is situated within the Grantham Institute, which itself sits within the London School of Economics. We're an independent, rigorous source of research and data into the progress that corporations and sovereign entities are making in the transition to a low-carbon economy. We're the research partner of the Transition Pathway Initiative, which itself is a global asset owner-led initiative supported by asset managers and service providers, as presented by David Russell. We aim to provide detailed and transparent methodologies to assess entities, to monitor their progress towards net zero, and assess their transition pathway trajectories. All our data is free and open access available on our website, together with the methodologies underpinning the data. If we move on to the next slide, I just want to briefly delve into some of the design principles underlying all, if not all, of our work. So the first one, which is also important for this webinar, is everything we do is disclosure-based. So the assessments that we're going to be talking about today rely exclusively on public information. Together with the fact that our methodologies are publicly available as well, we hope that this gives users the confidence that they can really understand what is the data saying that they're using. Secondly, we didn't want to, we do provide academic research and we do publish in journals, but really the key purpose of the TPI Centre is to provide investors with information that will help them, tackle the issue of climate change and manage the transition to net zero. We also didn't want to come in and provide yet another framework for disclosures. The idea was really to provide an independent assessment framework that works with existing disclosure frameworks such as CDP and TCFD. The assessments usually are both quantitative and qualitative. So for example, the targets aligned in a quantitative assessment and how are they supported by specific management measures in a qualitative assessment. So the idea is really to provide a holistic view, and that view is also informed by constant conversations with investors. So to a large degree, the assessments reflect investor expectations. Lastly, the frameworks and the assessments that we provide are designed to fit within a broader ecosystem. So for example, if you're familiar with the Net Zero Investment Framework or the Climate Action 100 disclosure benchmark, you will see that a lot of the data and a lot of our assessment frameworks share a lot of that DNA, and they're really designed to be interoperable, essentially. So with that, I will now hand over to my colleague Ali Amin, who's going to first explain our methodology for carbon performance in the oil and gas sector and then present some results. Over to you, Ali.
Thanks, Val, and thank you to everyone for joining the webinar today. So my name is Ali Amin, and I'm the Carbon Performance Research Project Manager. And as Val mentioned, I will be speaking about TPI's carbon performance oil and gas methodology and sharing some results from our latest assessment cycle. So if you can please move on to the next slide, please. And one more. So before going into the oil and gas methodology, I will spend a couple of minutes to set the theory behind how carbon performance works and what alignment actually means. So carbon performance ultimately assesses whether a company's emissions reduction targets are compliant with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the method is underpinned by an approach called sectoral decarbonisation approach. So the flow diagram on the left captures the essence of this process, SDA. But I'm sure as many on the call can understand and appreciate is that climate modeling is much more complex than that. And it's very difficult to quantify global systems and predict the future. But in very simple terms, at the very top of this flow diagram on the left, everything starts off with a prediction of what the global carbon budget needs to be in order to hold the temperature to a particular threshold. The budget is then used by global energy and climate models, such as those developed by the International Energy Agency, so IEA, and these allocate emissions to different sectors. And the reason why this is so important is because different sectors face different decarbonisation challenges. So the emissions are allocated to sectors by considering multiple dimensions, such as cost, availability of technology, and some other more nuanced factors, such as access to energy in developing nations. And simultaneously, as this model is outputting what the sector budgets needs to be, it also provides what the projections of that particular activity or the sector activity would be. So for example, this would be the tons of steel or megawatt hours of electricity produced. So the final step here is then we take the two outputs, divide the emissions by the corresponding activity, and produce the emissions intensity benchmarks. And what this allows is essentially to compare individual companies of different sizes and different starting points on the same benchmark metric, and also allows for a comparison for the company to be compared against other peers in the same sector. So now let us see how we use these benchmarks to actually measure alignment. So next slide, please. So this slide outlines how alignment is measured and the rationale behind it. If I draw your attention to the graph on the left-hand side, there are two main elements there. One, the area in the blue shows the different benchmark scenarios, and two, the company pathways themselves. So if a company pathway is below a given benchmark, it is considered to be aligned. Effectively, alignment can be measured in any given year building up to 2050, but the data set that we make available on TPI's online website, we provide alignment against 3 timeframes. So this is the short term, 2027, the medium term, 2035, and then in the long term, 2050. And the reason why we do this is if you remember in the previous slide, I mentioned that sectors and all of this SDA is initialized by cumulative emissions. So it's very important that the company's entire pathway is below a given benchmark and not only where it ends up in 2050. And then we provide 3 different scenarios, so national pledges, below 2 degree and 1.5 degree. And this is to assess companies with varying level of ambitions. As you can imagine, if we didn't do this, it would simply turn into a binary assessment of whether a company is aligned or not against the 1.5 degree, even though this is considered to be the most important benchmark and what the world should be aiming for as a whole. So then we come on to the company pathways, which we use, as Valentin mentioned, exclusively publicly disclosed information only. You can see here that company A is not aligned with any of the benchmarks in any of the timeframes. So this would be given a alignment of not aligned in the short term, medium term, and long term. Company B is aligned with national pledges, which is the least ambitious of the 3 scenarios. And then finally, company C in green is aligned with all benchmarks, including the most ambitious 1.5 degree in all 3 timeframes. So now that we understand how alignment is measured, we can move on to the oil and gas sector methodology specifically. So next slide, please. So when designing a sectoral methodologies, there's various considerations, but it really boils down to 2 main factors. One, are the most material emissions in a given sector being covered? And 2, are companies actually disclosing this information? So on the benchmark side, we use emissions from global energy, but adapt it to reflect the boundaries of the oil and gas sector. So the benchmarks are set at a global energy level, and it also reflects the transition towards the likes of renewables within this. So if I draw your attention to the equation and all the components within these, so these are all the adjustments or components that we use to develop the benchmarks. So on the numerator, we reflect the emissions from combustion activities only, and the denominator reflects the corresponding energy supply. But there are a few adjustments that we make to ensure 1, comprehensiveness, and 2, the accuracy of these benchmarks when we compare them or compare these metrics to companies. To highlight a couple of these examples, on the numerator, you can see that we add methane emissions separately, as IEA does not include these within their projections. And also, industrial process emissions are included within IEA, but we exclude them because these sit outside the direct emissions from the oil and gas sector. Similarly, on the denominator, as we all know, not all forms of energy is combustible, and as a result releases greenhouse gas emissions. So we exclude non-energy use. And also we calibrate our benchmarks by adjusting the denominator for transformational losses. So these are energy inputs or losses which occur from the primary energy to what is actually delivered. And the delivered energy is what we see on the company disclosure side. So to summarize this equation, the purpose of all these adjustments that we're making is essentially to match our benchmarks with the system boundaries of the companies, and at the same time, allow it to be representative of the sector as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, the second main principle or design consideration here is the company disclosure itself. So within the oil and gas sectors, scope 1 and 2 emissions are readily reported, but scope 3, and especially the use phase of the products, is not something which is consistently reported. So to overcome this disclosure gap and still provide a representative picture of the transition for these companies, given how material use phase emissions are, we calculate these emissions in-house. So we apply emission factors to various forms of product categories that companies disclose. And below the equation, you can see generally the 5 categories from which we find the company disclosure. So 1, these are reported under primary products. So these are crude oil and natural gases. Then we move on to refined products and finished, which are the likes of diesel and kerosene, and all the way to other energy like electricity generation and biofuels. So a final point that I want to make on this slide is that although we are calculating scope 3 emissions in-house, it is still indirectly dependent on good company disclosure on the sold products. So now that we've covered alignment and what the measurement metric on the oil and gas sector is, we can finally take a look at what the results look like. So next slide, please. So there are a few analysis pieces to unpick on this slide, but the main message that I'm trying to convey here is that Disclosure within the sector is good, but alignment by and large is not. So the bar charts on the left-hand side show a comparison of alignment across two cycles, one in 2020 and another one in 2023. This is essentially telling us whether the sector has shown any progress or improvement over the 3-year time period. If we focus on the medium term in the center bar charts and the long term, which is on the right-hand side, we see that some companies are starting to improve in terms of aligning with a given TPI benchmark. For example, in the long term in 2020, we had 2 companies aligning with below 2 degree and 1 on national pledges. But in the 2023 cycle assessment, we had a total of 11 companies aligning, with 5 actually aligning with the most ambitious 1.5 degree. So the large proportion of red that you see of not-aligned company is mainly due to 2 reasons, at least on a surface level and for the purposes of alignment. One is that companies are not setting enough targets. And second is that where they do set these targets, scope 3 emissions, which are the material emissions, are not part of them. So this is essentially the story that we see with the numbers on the right-hand side of the slide. So on the blue chart, which is on the top right-hand side, we see that 30 out of the 51 assessed companies set targets in the long term, so between 2036 and 2050. And this number drops gradually when you consider whether the same company set targets in the medium term and also in the short, medium and long term. The final bar chart, we see that 9 out of the 51 companies set targets across all 3 time horizons. And again, just to reiterate, it's important to set targets across all these timeframes because of the cumulative emissions. So as well as timeframe, another dimension which is perhaps critical and more so in the oil and gas sector is the coverage of these targets. So in the green pie chart, we see that 84% of 43 out of the 51 companies set some form of a target in any given time frame. And at the very least, these covered scope 1 and 2 emissions. But we see this number dropping significantly when you consider whether scope 3 were part of these emissions or emission targets or not. So 31% or 16 out of the 51 companies had targets which included scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions within these. So in summary, what we see here is that although there is some improvement by companies in setting targets, particularly in the long term, there is still a gap over the coverage of scope 3 emissions within these. So next slide, please, Alex. So final slide before I hand over to Jared, and I won't spend too much time on this given that I'm quite close to my 10-minute limit here, but just to give you a sense of what the pathways look like, these are results from the top 6 publicly listed oil and gas companies in the world by market cap. And this presents a good picture or a good mix of the different characteristics of pathways that we see. So taking, for example, the first 2 lines, we see that although these companies have set long-term targets into the 2050, because they haven't included scope 3 emissions within their targets, you see little or no difference to the emissions intensity pathway. So again, emphasizing the fact that scope 3 emissions, particularly use of soil products, is very important within oil and gas sector target setting. So I'll stop there and hand over to Jared, but more than happy to go into the details if you have any questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ali. Can we have the next slide, please? So welcome everyone. My name's Jared Sharp. I lead the TPI Centre work on the net zero standards for both oil and gas companies and diversified mining. Today, I'm going to talk to you about why we think the net zero standards is necessary to assess oil and gas companies. We're going to very briefly introduce you to the structure of the standard and then quickly run through some of the results. So if I can have the next slide, I want to very quickly explain why we think we need a typology that moves beyond company targets. A company's targets is really good for indicating the direction a company is intending to go, whether or not it's planning to transition, maybe even the temperature goal, the final temperature rise that the company is aligning with. But it only shows these high-level intentions with limited detail. When we get more into a company's strategy and we want to think about transition planning, what we really want to understand is a company's route through the transition, how it intends to action these targets. And through this, we can understand the challenges it might face, the risks, and also more accurately judge the ambition of this strategy. So if we quickly relate this to oil and gas, if I can have the next slide, I want to show you a very basic high-level overview of some of the decisions a company might face in the oil and gas sector. So one of the biggest discussions a company might have is whether or not it's going to reduce its production of oil and gas products. Then it's going to discuss whether or not it's going to do value chain decarbonisation, how it's going to do that, if it's going to use alternative energy sources. And we can see different companies are taking different pathways through this decision matrix. And because of this, they're facing different risks. Now, I want to be really clear and add some disclaimers in. This list of pathways isn't fully exhaustive. These pathways are not mutually exclusive. Many of these companies are taking different pathways through this simultaneously and therefore reducing their risk. So Total Energies, for example, is definitely an alternative fuels of hydrogen and biofuels and emissions abatement, as well as renewable power. But this is meant to be indicative that different companies are taking different pathways. And therefore, we need benchmarks that can reflect this complexity and can show investors and users of this data the relative risks of a company that is taking a different pathway. So with that, let me introduce you to the net zero standards. So if I can have the next slide, please. So the net zero standards was originally designed by IIGCC, and TPI has taken this on to do some of the assessment work for it. But as a quick overview, the net zero standards is designed as a bolt-on to the Climate Action 100+ framework, specifically the net zero disclosure framework. So if you don't know what that is, I'd really recommend going to the CO100+ website. But as a quick overview, Climate Action 100+ looks at the 160 biggest corporate disclosures in the corporate emitters in the world. It assesses everything from targets to strategy, capital expenditure, governance, disclosure, and historical emissions performance. What it isn't, however, is sector specific. And in order to increase comparability, it's taken a sector agnostic route. But the net zero standards is designed to bolt on to this framework to add in a sector specific consideration. And therefore it expands on the decarbonisation strategy, the capital allocation metrics, with some additions into long, medium-term targets and disclosure. And what the net zero standards really tries to drill down into is the strategic decision points that I showed you on the last slide. For example, is a company thinking about reducing its oil and gas production? You can see in the table on the right-hand side of your screens, oil and gas production is the most heavily weighted sub-indicator we have, 5V, with 18 metrics. And that will assess everything from the long-term oil and gas production, medium-term, the alignment of these forecasts, and maybe even the cost of production. So these sub-indicators are weighted based on the issue importance and the detail required to assess these decision sections. And it allows investors to see a route that a company is taking through the transition, and therefore gain some understanding on the ambition of a company's strategy and maybe some of the risks it will face. So if we can move on to results now with the next slide. So this is the results from the first assessment of the net zero standards. So we at the TPI Centre assessed 10 companies, 5 from Europe, 5 from North America. And this is showing the percentage score for each company split into the 3 metric types throughout the net zero standards. So these 3 metric types are disclosure, which is the information companies are providing about their climate activities, alignment, which is the level of ambition of those activities and their alignment to a 1.5 degree scenario, and climate solutions, which we've dealt with slightly separately, which is the integration of low carbon technologies. So as Ali said in the previous section, most companies are getting on board with some form of disclosure. We see scope 1 and 2 targets throughout the sector. And you can see from the far left side of this graph that most companies have some disclosure and some companies are doing very well in this section. This isn't the story we see in alignment, and the alignment metrics on the net zero standards are much more varied. And with this, unfortunately, we don't see the same amount of alignment in oil and gas production, alignment of targets, or alignment of CapEx. The climate solutions section of the results is a lot more varied. Some companies like Total that you can see at the top of this section are scoring very highly and diversifying throughout a range of climate solutions. And some companies are on the opposite pathway. They're scoring nothing. You might be able to notice that there's a large difference between European and North American companies. And we can show that on the next slide if we can move to that one. So while the previous slide showed an individual company level on scoring, this takes it more from a sub-indicator level. So we can see strengths and weaknesses in transition planning from the whole of the assessed companies. And we've also split this into North American and European companies to show strengths and weaknesses across the geographies. So the graph's showing the percentage of yes scores for each topic aggregated by geography. And what we can see is a massive difference in approach in the transition and strategy and CapEx between Europe and North America. European companies are scoring higher on almost every metric, and North American companies are scoring particularly badly in a wide variety of areas, particularly the climate solutions. In this case, this relates to both the strategy of climate solutions, 5 III, which American companies are scoring, North American companies are scoring 0% on, and the capital expenditure associated with this, which is green investment, metric 6 II. Some places, the difference is much smaller, methane, and following COP28, there's been a lot of progress on methane. And we can see this with the gap between North American companies and European companies being much smaller and the average being much higher. However, there's still a large way to go. Companies are signing up to the OGMP initiative and beginning to set medium-term targets, but there's still a lot of strategy missing in that, and there's still a long way to go for the sector. Production is even worse, and we see not many companies giving medium and long-term production forecasts split for oil and gas, and these being aligned in the future. So what I really want to get out of this is that different transition risks are really concentrated in different geographies, and they're also very diverse between companies. So when we're assessing transition strategies, I'd really like the takeaway to be that the direction shows a very high level company strategy, but in order to delve a lot deeper into the risks and challenges a company might face, we really need to look at the transition planning, some of the capital expenditure decisions. So with that, I'll hand over to some of our external speakers. So Dan Gardner is first. Thank you very much, and handing over.
Thanks, Jared, and good afternoon, everyone from me, and thanks to the TPI Centre for inviting me to present today. So my name's Dan Gardner. I head up what's called transition research here at IIGCC. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes on how investors are using some of the data that you've just been presented, in particular the net zero standard. If we could just move to the next, skip on a couple of slides. One more. So before we, sorry, if we can just go back a second, thank you. So yeah, before we get started, I'm obliged to show our disclaimer. I'm not going to read it out in full, you'll be relieved to know, but just to highlight that all IIGCC's work is conducted in accordance with the relevant laws, including competition and acting in concert rules. And participants in today's meeting will not be asked for and must not disclose or exchange strategically competitive, sensitive information or material non-public information. We just go to the next slide. First, I thought I should probably say a little bit about IIGCC. Hopefully many of you know who we are already, but in case there are some on the call that don't. IIGCC is a membership organisation for institutional investors seeking to understand, manage and ultimately mitigate the financial risks posed by climate change, while also seeking to fund investment opportunities potentially created by that transition. We have over 400 members, and just to give you a flavour of who those members are, so it's split relatively evenly between those based in the UK and those overseas, predominantly in Europe. All of a large proportion of the large asset managers are owners, are members, but we also have a roughly even split between owners and asset owners and asset managers, I should say. Many of our members have made individual voluntary commitments to manage their portfolios consistent with net zero. And most of those commitments have been made through a vehicle called the Net Zero Investment Framework, or NZIF, and I believe Bruce is going to reference this later in his slides as well. But this is driving a lot of the activity of our members and our work in more broadly. We, through the NZIF and our work, we are seeking to facilitate and accelerate a real economy decarbonisation. So this is not about a paper decarbonisation selling out of emissions intensive sectors, looking to predominantly through the vehicle of engagement with policymakers and underlying assets, drive that real economy decarbonisation. And our role is really to support our members through those engagement process, or a large part of our role, I should say, is supporting our members in that engagement process. And it's really in this context that the net zero standard was developed. Essentially, investors, our members, looking at this sector and seeing it as the largest and arguably the most concentrated source of transition risk that across their portfolios, needed to understand what was going on in the sector in more detail and pick up some of the nuances that Jared was referencing. So if we could just turn to the next slide. So on this slide, I'm going to sort of pick out some of the main uses of the net zero standard, but also TPI's work more broadly. So as some of you may remember, 2020 saw a raft of seemingly quite significant commitments being made by largely European oil and gas companies. And these were seen at the time as quite revolutionary in the sense that these were large entities seeking to transform their business away from fossil fuel activities towards broader and other forms of energy in some cases. And really our members wanted to, on close inspection of these commitments, notice that they are all couched in very different languages, cover different parts of the business, and they really needed a tool that would help them understand and compare these strategies effectively. And again, Jared's picked out some of those nuances previously. The net zero standard provides a lens by which to do that, and it's very useful in kind of highlighting those areas where commitments are strong and progressive, and those where there's still further work that the companies need to make. So that was kind of the scene in 2020, trying to digest these commitments. Over the last couple of years, notably the pace of kind of improvement in transition plans has somewhat slowed in the sector, given the kind of polarization of the ESG debate has particularly focused on, or particularly impacted, oil and gas. And investors have seen some stalling, I would say, in the kind of engagement conversations around the overall level of ambition. That has led some to kind of divest, and some to focus their engagement attentions at least on the demand side. But for those that are focusing and continue to focus on the sector, it remains a very important conversation. And in order to sustain sort of progressive conversations and to continue to drive forward change, the conversations have shifted towards more thematic topics. And these kind of nuanced and detailed topics are exactly the kind of thing that Net Zero Standard picks out. So I'm gonna highlight a couple of examples here, but there are others we could turn to. So the first one here is on fossil fuel or on capex in general. So this is a big one for investors, and obviously a lot of oil and gas companies' capex is directed towards maintaining existing production, but in many cases, an element of that capex is focused on new or extending fields. Investors have a specific interest in understanding more about this spending. Aside from it being inconsistent with net zero, as highlighted by the IEA, this spending carries a significant amount of transition risk according to what climate scenario you think we're heading towards. And is also effectively diverting cash away from that could otherwise go back to investors in the form of dividends or share repurchases. So the net zero standard, by asking for forward-looking disclosure here, helps investors really understand what companies' strategies are in relation to overall investment, but specifically investment in greenfield green new oil and gas assets, and it enables that spending to be tested for alignment as well. The second point I'd highlight here, and Jared picked up as well, was on production plans. Now, arguably, one of the successes already of the net zero standard has been encouraging companies to provide greater disclosure on their production. It's not perfect, as Jared highlighted, but we have seen significant improvements here. And when we first started talking about this was an area which companies were very reluctant to provide any data on at all. The third point here, as I would highlight, is climate solutions. So one of the unique facets of the net zero standard is requesting disclosure on companies' investments in low carbon technology. It does not penalize companies that don't opt for that as a transition strategy, but where they do, it does systematically request data both on capex and on energy outputs, so investors can really understand what the strategies are. And ultimately, this data is really useful as climate solutions is a component of the net zero investment framework as well. So investors are looking to understand their overall exposure here, and this data helps support that. So that's kind of the engagement angle. So it's been really important in those thematic conversations, but it's also, the data's also been useful for supporting voting considerations. And I should add or emphasize that investors use this data entirely at their own discretion and consistent with their own fiduciary duties and strategies. But it is, we understand, it has been very useful for voting this season. So we have incorporated elements or metrics from the net zero standard into what we call memos that we've circulated amongst our members. And the feedback that we've had from the working group and our broader membership is that these have been very useful for understanding the state of play of transition plans. And the third area I would highlight here is that on behalf of our members, we've also used some of the data and the metrics that we've created to inform and our consultation responses to various guidance activities undertaken by the UK and the European regulatory regimes. And we've had quite encouraging success in seeing some of the things that we've asked for and requested in the net zero standard taken into those forums and that guidance. So those are three kind of examples of how the net zero standard is being used. If we just go to the next slide. So if we kind of take a more forward-looking view of how the net zero standard could be used and TPI more data, obviously the standard itself, the data has only been available since the end of February, so it's very early days to kind of understand the full impact. But I think it's fair to say that the engagement conversations will continue to evolve. There's lots of new topics. Investors are continually looking at new topics to engage with companies about and enhance their ambition overall. But increasingly, investors looking at transition across their portfolio are having to take a move. You're adding a data lens to their activities, essentially wanting to understand transition risk across the sector, across their portfolio. And here is where the carbon performance data that TPI is really that TPI produces is particularly useful. So on the left-hand side of this chart, you can see the carbon performance chart similar to the one that Ali presented, covering the net zero, the oil and gas companies covered by the net zero standard. One of the methodologies that we've produced out ourselves in the last few months is a thing called cumulative benchmark divergence, which essentially translates the alignment of those paths as represented by those pathways into a single metric, which looks essentially at the relative gap between the company pathway and the benchmark over the course of the entire pathway. And that's the chart on the right-hand side here. So you can see very simply that the US companies, the ones that have typically only set scope 1 and 2 targets, have very high divergence scores, whereas those that have made net zero commitments including scope 3, have got relatively lower scores, and this is a really useful way for our members to kind of, we think, to understand the relative transition risks of companies in this space. I should add that as a single metric, no single metric is perfect, and it should be aligned with a broader suite of metrics covering other activities. For example, for those of you that have had a chance to look at the net zero oil and gas data, you can see that the transition plan elements around strategy for a company like Oxy, it scores very, very poorly, for example. So raising the question that about how credible that commitment that Oxy has made, for example, would be. So it is just one metric, but we think a useful way for those that are looking at a portfolio level to analyze transition risk in this space. That was essence for me. That was it from me, but I'm going to hand over to Bruce, and hopefully he can talk through also another perspective from the investor side.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you to TPI as well for hosting this webinar and inviting me to explain how we use the TPI in various of our activities as a stewardship service provider. If you just turn to the next slide, and the next one after that, just a brief introduction to EOS at Federated Hermes. We are a stewardship service provider. We're part of the asset manager, Federated Hermes Limited, and we work on behalf of a large range of mostly asset owner and some asset manager clients who are based across 14 different countries. And we enable those long-term institutional investors to be more active owners of their assets through dialogue with companies on long-term drivers of sustainable value creation. We engage with around 1,000 companies a year. About half of those are on a continuous relationship basis, and some of those will be more ad hoc reactive to events. But many will be oil and gas companies, and so it's with that experience that I'll talk a bit today as well. If you just turn to our next slide. We're quite heavy users of the TPI. We consider it to be a really valuable tool to investors, and so we thank the TPI and its supporters for putting together this global resource. And one of the ways that we use this is in our voting recommendations. We provide voting recommendations to our clients that are complement our engagement work. And we look at the management score as an input into good governance on climate risks. And those companies that are scoring below a level 4 are in our danger zone. It depends somewhat on the sector and the region, how we consider things and the engagement progress, but that will mean we might consider recommending a vote against the more responsible director that's up for election. If you just turn to the next slide. We look to see alignment of the companies that we engage with. Our goal is to ensure that as many companies as possible are aligned to the Paris goals and targets. And as Dan referenced, and it's he and his colleagues' great work, we use the net zero investment framework as a really good way to define alignment. And we've created a series of tools that seek to do this. And if you turn to the next slide, the heart of this is a Paris alignment test that we do based on the targets. And this is where we can use the TPI data as one of the good inputs that help us to determine alignment of a company's targets. We will look at that pathway. We will also look at what could be an imputed science-based target equivalent pathway if the TPI is not available or as an alternative methodology. And we will look at alignment against either 1.5 or below 2 degrees. We have a similar philosophy that both are relevant. Of course, we want the more ambitious set of targets. subject to appropriate dependencies. And we seek the right metric for that. Often it's carbon intensity, but there may be other ways to look at it. And we'll talk about oil and gas in a moment. We like a data source that is open source, where we can understand the methodology, and then we can compare results and understand where companies might argue the difference. And we can also align companies that may not yet be covered in the long tail of different investments that we and our clients have. If you turn to the next slide. So we're talking today about oil and gas and the results of the TPI. And as I say, that's very useful to us. The tests in the oil and gas sector are quite challenging, and they're challenging for a number of reasons. Partly, it is a hard to abate sector, both operationally, scope 1 and 2, and for its scope 3 emissions. The product at the moment, the fossil fuel products, are intrinsically high carbon. There's many different types of decarbonisation pathway, as Jared pointed out, and substitute products are not that easy to just drop in the same way that, say, renewable electricity can substitute higher carbon electricity. So there's significant dependence on demand side changes. For example, a hydrogen boiler instead of a gas methane boiler. Decarbonisation pathways may not all be equal across regions, and there's the significant role of national oil companies and sovereigns' energy security and approach to royalties that will affect these pathways. And so exactly what an aligned pathway looks like is going to probably vary by institution and geography. There's also a complex and dynamic value chain, many different types of player that we have to appraise in our portfolios. Some will be pure upstream, some will be pure midstream or pure downstream. Super majors may cover all of those things. They may also have other businesses that we need to carve out, for example, chemicals or financial trading. And so this makes the task of comparison complicated. If you turn to the next slide, this is the TPI chart as we've seen. Seen the latest. This is an old version. We've seen the new one, but the focus here is on the CO2 per megajoule, and scope 3 dominates that, but scope 1 and 2 is a part of it, as I understand. But if you turn to the next slide, what we find is that to be able to compare multiple companies, some of which may be upstream only, for example, and not have a diversification strategy, we need multiple indicators to try to get a line of understanding on degrees of alignment. So we tend to look at scope 1 and 2 separately to scope 3, and we will look at that on a percentage change in absolute emissions. Could look at intensity. It's not normally published. There are some issues around the accounting of asset sales and purchases. Should they be included and rebased? We think generally yes. And also looking separately at methane, which can have special characteristics and targets and be another sub-indicator. We also look at scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions on an absolute basis. So for those companies who may not be transitioning or only transitioning in part, then the change in absolute greenhouse gas emissions is quite a good indicator. Again, you've got the asset sales question. You've got a question whether to look at upstream and downstream separately. And also, some companies will argue that their increase in natural gas is displacing coal. And so there's a scope 4 avoided emissions to take account. So that's an argument that we need to be aware of, even if it's not part of our test. Then we also look at the same metric that TPI use, intensity of products sold. there are some challenges in the methodology. The TPI crew are well aware of these, but how companies report on the fossil fuel equivalents of renewables is something that needs to be teased out. And there are some other challenges around what to include and exclude. The last one that we look at is CapEx alignment, and we find this to be particularly relevant. And it could almost be an overriding metric. So if a company can show that each new material capital expenditure plan is consistent with Paris goals, it is low cost. That may permit a company to not be otherwise reducing its emissions because it's one of those last players standing, as they sometimes term it. And so we have a series of economic tests for that. We look at exclusion policy, we look at CapEx on low carbon. All of those are good indicators for us. If we just turn to the next slide, and I'll hand off quite quickly on this because to allow time for discussion. But if we use multiple tests, there is still a challenge for us how they interact and which ones might supersede others. We have a challenge around exactly what scenarios to use and should we look at regional pathways. And I think there is an underlying challenge in all these tests, the question of what are they really looking at? Is it alignment to the Paris goals? Is it consistency? Or is it transition resilience? And that may be the difference between a managed decline company being consistent with Paris, but not necessarily having such good transition resilience. I'll pause there because of the time and hand back to the TPI team to look at Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bruce and Dan, for your really valuable input into how you use your data. You posed some really interesting questions as well. That you know, kind of just showcasing that this is an ongoing conversation, and the net zero standard also just came out, you know, earlier this year. So a lot of development in the space. So with that, I just want to remind everyone to please add any questions that you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and also upvote any kind of questions that you think are most interesting. So with that, I have a first question here. It's more of a technical one, but this one I think is for you, Ali, which is how is total primary energy supply and demand defined?
So yeah, we as I mentioned mainly use IEA modeling. So how IEA essentially defines primary energy is it refers to the raw energy content of energy sources before any conversion or transformation processes. So these are the likes of fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, and including nuclear and hydropower. So essentially the global energy mix before the companies actually do any transformation on it. And then the delivered energy is what's actually is delivered to the system after considering all of the losses within the processes. Sorry, Val, you're on mute.
So, thank you very much, Ali, for that. So the next question I think has been requested by 3 people. It's a slightly more contentious one, but I'm just gonna try and give it to you, Bruce and Dan, either one of you who wants to go first, or not at all if you don't feel comfortable. But how do you deal with political realities where North American companies may lag behind their EU peers? As your study illustrates, are those realities accounted for?
I'm happy to say a word or two on that. The data shows a pattern there, and I think that's shows that company performance is partly a matter of investor expectation. It's partly also influenced by national politics and expectations. So I think that's a reality. It's part of how we look at our influence on companies on behalf of investors. We're not the only influence on companies, and so we always need some humility in the changes that we can achieve and the extent to which we can get a pace of change. But for example, if there's a difference in national goals on net zero, there will say 2050 versus 2060 or 70 in other countries, you would tend to see that feature in corporate goals. So it's just something that we have to contend with.
The only thing I would add from my perspective is of course that as IIGCC, we're not seeking to ourselves cast judgment on like the company strategies per se, but we are surfacing the data that enables our members to make those judgments. And I think it's, you know, the value of the TPI's work, as you've seen, is really highlighting the diverging path that the US and Europe are going on. And the interesting question for us on this, we've kind of thought about is for example, would Europeans relocating to the US mitigate some of their broader challenges? Would that actually help? Would that help them? Would they see any benefit from that, or is it the policy regime in Europe which is actually constrained, which is acting on them? I would say that it's the broader policy regime is the one that's kind of driving that to essentially picking up on Bruce's point, that's driving that divergence as much as anything.
Thank you very much. And just to say, there are quite a few questions here that are relatively that are specific to, are you going to do this, or when is this going to be available? So for those questions, maybe just reach out to us at tpi@lsc.co.uk so we can answer those there. More kind of content related questions. There's a question in the Q&A. Sorry, my window just moved. Asking, sorry. Yes, which I find very interesting. And sorry, again, this is primarily for Bruce and Dan, but Jared and Ali, feel free to jump in here. So this is about managed decline. So I think, this is a topic that has been floating around since we started the work on this. We haven't seen anything. It's a little bit of a mirage in a way. So I'm curious what you think, what your comments are about this question. What are the obstacles to companies choosing a managed decline approach? Do you think any companies in the sector are likely to choose this path? And yeah, maybe Dan, if you want to go first with this one, and then Bruce or Jared, Ali, if anyone wants to chip in.
It's a great question, and we've been thinking about this theoretically for like 4 or 5 years now, and we've yet to kind of see it. I think the catalyst for this, if and when we are going to see it, is when we start to see oil demand and therefore supply fall, and we're possibly not too far away from that. So recognizing that the market is heading in one direction, and not all players, particularly those focused on upstream, are equally equipped to diversify. I'll leave comments there in case others want to come in.
Yeah, I think you do, when you look at oil and gas companies, sometimes they'll have different projections for oil and gas, and you can see some projections for lower consumption of oil. Different companies will have, as they transition to renewables or low carbon capital, actually falling output of oil and gas. That's not necessarily managed decline of the whole business, but it is perhaps a decline of one part of it on the fossil side.
Thank you very much. So we're unfortunately at time. I'm just going to say a few more things about what's in the Q&A, because we got a lot of questions at the end. So thank you also to the audience for that. Really great questions. So just to re-emphasize, please reach out to us via email. We're very happy to answer those questions. We're very glad that people are very interested in the data. We're always happy to help anyone who wants to use this data, wants to understand more about it, to do that. And also to say there will be a recording of this webinar on the TPI website. I don't know exactly whether that's going to include the slides, but that should hopefully already be helpful. And we'll follow up with anybody who registered via email as well, to just make you aware exactly where to find that. So with that, another very big thank you to Ali and Jared for your excellent presentations, and obviously to Bruce and Dan for your thoughts and comments, and to David Russell, the chair of TPI. So thank you very much.